Hello, my name is Bree, and I'd like to welcome you to my channel, Breezy Banter, the place where I talk about the things I want to talk about. In today's video, I'm doing something a little bit different, where I decided that I wanted to discuss some of my favorite books. So if you're not aware, reading is probably my biggest hobby in terms of time spent doing it. And it's also one of my, let's say, longest duration hobbies. Like, I remember reading as a kid. I read all throughout adolescence, well into my teenage years, during university, even when I was super busy, and now, even though I'm a working individual. And I love reading. I will read anything that anyone recommends to me at some point. So even if a book is recommended to me that I suspect that I will not like, I'll still read it if it's being recommended to me. And I also make a effort to read books that I also think that I might sometimes disagree with, particularly when it comes to nonfiction books and, let's say, like political books. I think it's a good idea to be exposed to ideas that one might not agree with, both because it can expand your mind. Perhaps whoever's writing the book will raise a point that that calls into question your own belief, and then you have to think about it and wrestle with it, and I think that's a really good and healthy thing to do. And I also think it's just important to know what other people think. I know that no one in the world thinks the exact same way that I do. And so understanding why people believe what they do and how they come to the conclusions in their life is, again, just really important to me. So before we get started, I wanted to give a little bit of background. So I am an avid user of the website Goodreads to track my book reading. Based on what I have on my Goodreads, it tells me that I have rated 116 books 5 stars. And while I won't be discussing every single book, because 116 books is a lot to get through, I will include a full list of all the 5-star books that I've read, either in the description or in a comment, depending on how much space I have. In terms of the genres that I tend to really enjoy, for fiction, I really like dystopian, fantasy, classics, satire, and realism. And then when it comes to nonfiction, I really enjoy political, gender political, cognitive, and epistemological topics. And I'll tell you who my favorite authors are, and I'll also give a bit of a caveat. So my 5 favorite authors are Rebecca Solnit, Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, John Steinbeck, and Nassim Nicholas Taleb. One thing I will mention, because I'm a feminist, to be frank, and some of these authors they're believed to be misogynistic. However, I don't feel a need to like characters in order to like a book. And I think this is something that a lot of people struggle with based on criticisms of so many things that I've seen, particularly when it comes to media. There will be certain characters that are not meant to be likable. And people will say, I didn't like that book because I didn't like the character. And I don't really grok that understanding of a book or whatever other media this is occurring in. I fundamentally do not understand it. And I don't have that same belief. I can read something, dislike a character, but end up loving the book. One of the books that we'll talk about, which is my favorite book of all time, is this phenomena in spades. So with all of that said, what I've done is I've gone through my list and picked out books that I think are perhaps lesser known, or they're like really my favorites, like they're all 5 stars, but these are like 5 stars. And so these are the ones that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to read the description on Goodreads and perhaps just briefly explain why I rated it 5 stars. So the very first book that I have here is Attacking Faulty Reasoning, A Practical Guide to Fallacy-Free Arguments. And I rated this book 5 stars because this book was recommended to me in university by a professor. And to me, it's not a particularly long book. Goodreads says it's 256 pages. But if you want a very good summary of common fallacies that people make when making arguments or when working through their reasoning, this is a really good book to learn about that. And also it's a practical guide to how to avoid it in your own reasoning. So to me, this book is a very good primer on better reasoning, which I think is something everyone needs to know about and needs to work on, including myself. Next is the book The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. If I had to name, this book is written by Naomi Klein. If I could pick a sixth favorite author, which I guess I can, I don't know why I capped myself out at 5, but if I could name 6, Naomi Klein would be my 6th. My only like real disagreement with her is she's anti-nuclear and I'm very much pro-nuclear, and I think we both see a problem, we just disagree on how to solve that problem. So we both believe in, for example, climate change, which you should, and I just happen to think that nuclear is one of the best, if not the best, way to combat that, and she disagrees. But we both think it's a problem, and that's like the one area in which I disagree with her on. Everything else, basically what she says, like, to me it seems very well reasoned. And so this book is described as, in her groundbreaking reporting from Iraq, Naomi Klein exposed how the trauma of invasion was being exploited to remake the country in the interest of foreign corporations. She called it disaster capitalism. And so that intro mentions Iraq. The book talks about many, many more places than just Iraq. But I read this book in university and I remember finishing it and just kind of being in shock, because like, you know that this stuff happens, but when you see the on the ground reporting of what's going on, it's kind of wild. And so I really enjoyed this book. It is a bit of a long one. This is 558 pages. Next are 2 books that I'm kind of combining into 2. One is Batman the Killing Joke and the other is Batman the Dark Knight Returns. And I read both of these books as part of a elective that I had to take in university. I think it was like graphic novels or intro to graphic novels. And I'm so glad that I took that course, because I think had I read the books, I think I would have enjoyed them. Probably not at a 5-star level, but by taking the course and hearing from someone that like their work is in analyzing graphic novels, I learned so much, and I appreciate to such a greater degree than previously the amount of work that goes into graphic novels. There were so many things that my instructor or other people in my class like pointed out, and I was like, there is no chance I would have picked up on that on my own, but it makes perfect sense now that I see it. So I'm very glad that I was introduced to graphic novels in that way, because there are some great ones out there, the Batman ones being no exception. Next is the book The Black Swan, The Impact of the Highly Improbable. This is a book by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who I mentioned is one of my favorite authors. I'm only going to mention one of his books, but his entire, I think it's called Inserto series is like 10 out of 10, fully recommend every single book in that series. This book is number 2 in that series. The description for this book says, a groundbreaking exploration of everything we know about what we don't know, now with a new section called On Robustness and Fragility. So a black swan is a highly improbable event with 3 principal characteristics. It is unpredictable, it carries a massive impact, and after the fact, we concoct an explanation that makes it appear less random and more predictable than it was. The astonishing success of Google was a black swan, so was 9/11. For Nassim Nicholas Taleb, black swans underlie almost everything about our world, from the rise of religions to events in our own personal lives. And again, this was a book that was recommended to me in university because I was struggling. I studied mechanical engineering, and I was really struggling with the idea of being an engineer and doing something for the public where I could do my best, I could put my professional engineering stamp on whatever I was stamping, have it be made, and then watch it fail, but not having done anything wrong myself. And so a professor who I was talking about this with had recommended this book to me, and I'm so glad that he did. It is so good. I know I've had a few friends and family members try to read it, and they said that they found it difficult to follow, particularly because of the math. I would say, I suspect you could come away from this book without really following the math, but following sort of the more abstract ideas behind the book and still like really getting the point. But this book is mathematically backed. And so I very much recommend this to others. It was so interesting. And again, the entire series written by this author is excellent. Next is the book, The Paradox of Choice, Why More is Less. This is a social critique of our obsession with choice and how it contributes to anxiety, dissatisfaction, and regret. And I read this book quite a while ago, and I think what was so revelatory at the time that I read it was we were always, for the most part, told that like choice is the best. If you go into a grocery store, you want to have the choice of 375 cereal boxes. But what this book showed is that actually isn't necessarily a good thing. It's good to the extent that choice is good, but people tend to be happier with their choices when there's some limitations placed on it. So if I say, hey, pick one of these cereals, and there's 375 boxes to pick from, you're gonna be left wondering, oh, did I really make the right choice? I'm not sure. Do I have to go back and try all the other boxes? But if I had, say, 5, you're probably gonna feel much less anxious about the decision that you made, more satisfied with what you picked, and you're not gonna have these lingering feelings of doubt. And so that's just one example, and it applies much more broadly than that. And I had never really thought about this. I never really thought about choice in this way. And so it really just opened my eyes to something that I think is worth thinking about. Next is the book, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. And I won't mention the other books in this series. The first 3 in the series is called the Millennium series, are written by the original author, Stieg Larsson. And I know I've read some after the 3rd one, but to me, the original 3 books written by the original author are the best. The author died. And what I think is very interesting is this book in its original language, which I believe is Swedish, is called Men Who Hate Women. And I think it's very interesting because this book has been accused of being misogynistic, but I think there's a difference between, to me, there can be a difference between depicting something as misogynistic, because misogynistic things happen in this world, and so sometimes they are going to be depicted in media, versus depicting something misogynistic and endorsing it. And so this book does have examples of misogyny, but I do not think they're endorsed. And I think if you know that the title of the original book is Men Who Hate Women, that becomes much more obvious. This is a thriller book, a crime thriller. I tend to really enjoy crime thriller movies, so I was glad to have the option to read this book. Next is The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, written by Jonathan Haidt. And this book is very, very interesting to me because it really discusses, basically as the title says, why do people believe different things? And the author has there's a website that you can go to where it's called the Moral Foundations, I believe, and you can take the test, and it's depending on the test that you take, because I know I've done it several times in the past where there are 5 criteria against which you're scored, and other times I've taken it and there are 6, but there are 5 main things that people base their moral values on, and that includes harm, fairness, equality, purity, and loyalty. And the 6th one that sometimes gets added is freedom. And so what the author has found is that, for example, conservatives and liberals score relatively similar across, let's say, fairness, but conservatives score much more highly on purity. And so it's interesting because I'm not a conservative, but if a conservative values something like purity to the degree that I value, let's say, fairness, we're coming at problems, ethical issues, political issues with very different backgrounds. And I think this book it made me think about that in a different way. And I'm perhaps a bit more sympathetic to the idea that somebody can hold a value as strongly as I hold my own core values. And I might not share those same values with them, but I need to be able to find a way to still come to a good conclusion. And this book is challenging, I think. Not challenging in terms of reading it, but challenging in terms of what it makes the reader think about and realize. Next is the book Merchants of Doubt, How a Handful of Scientists Obscured the Truth on Issues from Tobacco Smoke to Global Warming. And this book is very, very interesting, and I wish more people read it because it's kind of crazy to think about. Basically, this book is kind of the FUD model, fear, uncertainty, doubt explained. There are 2 people discussed in this book that come up again and again and again when it comes to controversial issues, and their role in these issues was to spread doubt. How do we know climate change is happening? But that's just one area, and there would be congressional hearings on the addictiveness of nicotine, and those same people would be there spreading doubt. And then there would be a congressional hearing on like acid rain, and these people would be there spreading doubt. And so it's just very interesting to see how that has happened and how much the impact of these individuals that are focused on in the book, I don't think can be overstated. And I think they're people who most people wouldn't be able, if I told you their names, which I won't because I think you should read the book, you likely have never heard of them. Yet their impact is incredible in a very bad way. Next is the book Super Forecasting, The Art and Science of Prediction. And so this one was very interesting because I think the conclusions that were arrived at in this book were very interesting, because one of the key takeaways that I got from this book was that the people who were really good at forecasting the future were not super geniuses. We're not talking people with IQs of like 170 who do nothing but like read news articles all day. What they found was that the people who were really good at predicting future events were people who were smart, but again, not like incredible geniuses, but had a humility with which they approached problems. And so they very incrementally changed their minds on certain political topics, and they were more correct than people who had an initial inclination one way or another about a prediction and then just stuck with it. And I think that's just very interesting. Next is the book The Name of the Wind, which is book number 1 in the King Killer Chronicle. This is a fantasy book, and I loved this book. It did take me a little bit to get into it. If I recall, I read like 50 pages and I was just like, I cannot do this. But then I read it, I started to read it, I put it down, and then I started to read it a second time, ended up loving it. If you're into fantasy, you've probably heard of this, but if you haven't, then I absolutely recommend this one. Okay, the next book is my favorite book of all time, and it's The Catcher in the Rye. And I think I have such a soft spot for this book in my heart. I've read it multiple times, and if you ever talk to someone about why they don't like Catcher in the Rye, they'll say that they don't like Holden, who's the main character, if you haven't read it. And I think that's, like I said in the beginning, I think that's so amusing because, like, if you've seen the movie, like, The Dark Knight, you don't like the Joker, but you can still like the movie, right? Like, I don't think we're intended as an audience to enjoy the person that is the Joker. We're not thinking about, like, going out and having a beer with the Joker, right? And so I don't understand why this applies certain media and not others. I think it's well known that Holden is meant to be an anti-hero. You're not necessarily supposed to like him. People will call him like insufferable and miserable and all of these things. And it's like, he's a kid. Like, he's literally just like a teenager dealing with some pretty serious, heavy stuff. And people are out there acting like they weren't annoying people when they were 16. I really, really enjoy this. And if you haven't read it, or if you have and want to reread it, I encourage you to do so with a more open mind. Of course, you might still not like it, and that's fine too. I just think it gets a bad rap. Next is the book A Gentleman in Moscow. And I loved this book so much. So many of the books that I've discussed thus far are nonfiction, and so it's pretty rare for a fiction book to really get me to rate it 5 stars. And when I originally read this book, I think I had to try it like 3 times to get into it. It was like a little slow moving at first. And then once I did get into it, I could not stop. I don't really want to say a lot about it. It's basically about a man who has to live in a hotel during, I believe, like 1920s Russia or so. And it's kind of his life in that hotel, the people that he meets, the relationships that he forges, and the events that are happening, because that's a pretty pivotal time in Russia. And it's just so good. Very much recommend it. Next is the book Columbine. This is a book about the tragedy in Columbine. And I rated this book 5 stars because there has been a lot of misinformation and then misinformation about misinformation that has come out because of Columbine. I very distinctly remember a clip of, at first people were talking about how the 2 boys who did it were bullied. And then it kind of slowly came out that, well, no, they might have been bullies. And that's just one aspect for which there was like a lot of questions and not a whole lot of answers. And reading this book was very interesting because to me, this is like the de facto account of what happened in Columbine. The research that went into this book is incredible. And so if you have like any questions, or perhaps you don't have a lot of knowledge about what happened there, I would absolutely recommend this book for that purpose, to learn more about it. Next is Saga, which is a graphic novel. And this book, or these books, I'm including the entire Saga collection here, it is just so good. It is again, like a fantasy science fiction type graphic novel. And I remember when I first started to read it, I think I got to like book 7 or so. And I had said something to my friend like, I'm not sure how they're going to finish this in the next few issues. And my friend said something like, well, what do you mean? Like the series is still going? And I was like, no, like there's only 9 books. And then he was like, no, they're taking a break right now, but they're coming back to it. And I got so upset because I've had to wait years for the remaining volumes to come out, and like it's still not done. And it's so good that it is so hard to do that. And so even though that is the case, I would still recommend this to other people. I do plan on going back and rereading it as more volumes come out. It is just so good. I don't even know how to begin describing it. Like intergalactic love, combat, friendships, family. Yeah, very much recommend this to others. Next is the book Where the Crawdads Sing. And so this is another book that I've heard some criticisms of it that I don't agree with. They're primarily about, there are 2 characters in the book that are Black, and I've heard them described, like the criticism is that they're stereotypical Black characters, and maybe, but I don't actually think that that's necessarily a negative in this book. I think you can still have someone that is a stereotype, but still have them be like a good character in the book, and I think that that is true for this book. I've described this book to other people as like The Godfather, but like my version of The Godfather, and I love this book so much. Next is the book In a Different Key, The Story of Autism. And the reason I gave this book 5 stars was because I originally gave it 4, but I could not stop thinking about it, and I went back and gave it 5 stars. And this book focuses on basically the history of autism, and I suspect I'm on the spectrum, but I'm not like tied to that label. I don't have particular like thoughts or concerns or whatever with the label, with the identity, etc. Though I recognize that I'm in a fortunate position where that is the case. But learning about it, particularly as it affects women, which this book doesn't focus on its effect on women, but it does talk about it a little bit. It's just very interesting to see how the diagnosis of autism has, as it has grown over the past 100 years, how it has changed. I can't think of the right word, like the information that goes into that diagnosis is very interesting. And I think the stories that they focus on in the book are meticulously well researched and very, very interesting. Next is the book What Happened. This is Clinton's memoir about the 2016 presidential election. I don't really have much to say about this other than there's a quote in this book that I still think about from time to time. She said something along the lines of, even if a woman becoming president doesn't mean a lot to you, recognize that it means a lot to other people. And to me, that just hit so hard because it can feel awful to try to tell someone why something means so much to you and not have them understand. And I think hearing her say something like that is very affirming, I guess, because it basically says, like, you don't have to agree with me and think that it's a big deal. Just recognize that for me, it is a big deal. And that's just, it's such a small part of the book, but the things that she talks about, the life that she's had, are both super interesting. And so hearing her thoughts about 2016 was very harrowing, but I recommend it. Next is the book Shake Hands with the Devil, The Failure of Humanity in Rwanda. This is a book that I think about probably like once a week. And I read this, I'm just trying to find when I read it, 2020. I read it 4 years ago. And I still think about this book all the time. Romeo Dallaire was an individual who basically led the humanitarian effort in Rwanda during the Rwandan genocide. Reading this book is, I just use the word harrowing, but there isn't really a better word for it. It's harrowing. And I believe it's this book that makes some comment, these numbers are wrong, but you'll get my point, It said something about how during the Rwandan genocide, there was 186 seconds of coverage on major news networks about it. And that's something that I just think about all the time. And it's one of the reasons that I enjoy like indie books, indie movies, etc. And why I also don't consume that much news media, because I don't like being told which perspectives I need to listen to. And I don't like being told what issues I should care about, because I can't necessarily blame someone who gets their news from a major news network who didn't hear about Rwanda. Well, innocent people were being killed and they didn't know. Why would they know? And that's not how I want to live my life. I don't want the things that I care about to come from major news networks. As I was mentioning, when it comes to indie films, is I like hearing indie films are where you're more likely to hear perspectives that are outside of the norm. And I think that's important. What's described in this book is extremely difficult to deal with, to understand, to come to terms with. I think if you read this book, you will be angry with the powers that be. I certainly was. Next is the book Recollections of My Non-Existence, a memoir. This is by one of my favorite authors, Rebecca Solnit. This is the only book of hers that I'm including in this list, but so many of hers I've rated 5 stars. So this is her memoir, and I think Rebecca Solnit is just a very well-reasoned, empathetic person, and what she has to say is important. Next is Say Nothing, a true story of murder and memory in Northern Ireland. This book is about the Troubles, and this author, if I could pick a 7th author, that would be my favorite author. He would be my 7th. His name is Patrick Radden Keefe. He's written several books that are very good, and this book, I'll be honest, before I started reading it, I don't think I'd ever heard of the Troubles. And this is another book where the research that went into it, what was discovered and talked about, was just incredible, particularly as someone who hadn't heard anything about it. And it was very, very riveting and also very sad. Next is the book A Libertarian Walks Into a Bear, the Utopian Plot to Liberate an American Town. This book is very interesting because it's a nonfiction book about, there's a town in, I believe, New Hampshire called Grafton, where they basically tried to implement, or are trying to implement, a libertarian utopia. And as someone who has small L libertarian leanings, I don't consider myself I think when you say libertarian, there are certain connotations that people have with that, and I don't really agree with some views that are commonly ascribed to libertarians, but I do tend to have, like I said, small L libertarian leanings. But what this book did was took a look at basically this project that I think is still happening in Grafton, and by all accounts, I would say it's a failure. I'm sure there are some people who disagree with me, but I just remember, I think it was one of the stats from the book that they mentioned that the presence of sex offenders went from 2 before the project started to over 1,000 or something. And it's yeah, that's kind of what's gonna happen if you don't have rules and laws in place. And this book, I used to deal, well, to some degree I still deal with policy in my career, but I used to deal with it a lot more. And as someone who saw the other side of policy, creating policy and how you do that and the ways in which policy comes to be, I became a lot more sympathetic to the idea that good policy is really hard, and there's very, very likely a reason why a policy exists. And if you don't know, if you are likely to criticize a policy for existing or for being written a particular way, I would very much encourage you to think about why it might be written that way or why that policy exists. Because in this book, New Hampshire has a lot of bears, and in most municipalities, there are rules around trash collection, and they didn't have that here, and people would literally put out food for bears, and it became very dangerous. And there are some incidents described in the book where it's yeah, there are I don't think the municipal government is trying to oppress you by saying we're going to pick up your garbage Monday morning at 8 a.m. But some libertarians might feel that way, and so they rebel against it by throwing away all of those rules that exist But it turns out if you live in bear country, which these people in Grafton do, like there was a reason for it. So it's just very interesting to read about. Next is the book The Emperor of All Maladies, a biography of cancer. This book is by Siddhartha Mukherjee, I believe. He's written a few other books that are also very good. To me, this is a all-encompassing book about cancer. Difficult to read, sad to read, but also interesting from a scientific perspective as well. Next is the book Ace, What Asexuality Reveals About Desire, Society, and the Meaning of Sex. I'm not asexual, but I also struggle to really understand it. And I think this book was a really good primer on it. And while I still have questions, I can't really say that I do fully understand it after reading this book, I think it went a long way to helping me empathize with people who might be asexual. Next is the book Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do? And this is by Michael J. Sandel. He's written several other books that are also very, very good. There are a few videos of him on YouTube, basically leading a philosophy 101 course, or maybe like an ethics 101 course. And it's free, you can look it up. It's very interesting. He's very good in that he encourages people to think. He's not going to tell you what the answer is or what his answer is necessarily, but he asks questions to kind of poke at perhaps weaknesses in other people's reasoning. And so I thought that this book was very good. Next is the book Rise of the Warrior Cop, The Militarization of America's Police Forces. This book is by Radley Balko, who has written, again, several other very good books. I really like Radley Balko as a journalist. I think his views often very much align with mine. He basically writes a lot about civil liberties, and this book was a bit of a shock when I read it. There are certain things that I didn't know about. I had kind of like a sense about certain things in this book, and then when I read about it, it was like eye-opening, and yeah, very much recommend it. Next is the book How to Be Perfect, The Correct Answer to Every Moral Question. This was written by the creator of The Good Place, and he also, I believe, was a co-creator or writer on Parks and Rec. I haven't seen either of those. I've seen like clips here and there of both of them, but this book was very good because I think it's very funny, and it also points out some absurdities in terms of if you take certain moral principles to their conclusion. Next is The Power Broker, Robert Moses and the Fall of New York. This is a very, very long book. Goodreads tells me it's 1,300 pages, and it's a very interesting one because Robert Moses was a man who never held a publicly elected position, but he had immense power over the shaping of New York City. And this book is like not a memoir, a biography of his life and the decisions that he made and the impact that he had. And it was fascinating and also a little infuriating at the same time. But again, I recommend it. Next is Ducks, 2 Years in the Oil Sands. This is written by Kate Beaton, who has, I believe she still has, a online comic webpage. And I've seen her stuff before. I think she's very talented, but she wrote about her 2 years that she spent in northern Alberta, which is like an oil and gas country, basically. As someone who is from Alberta originally and knows lots of people who have worked, have gone and worked, still work, will work in the oil sands, this book was a difficult one, but also a very, very good one. It's a graphic novel as well. Next is the book Determined, A Science of Life Without Free Will. And this book was very interesting because I mentioned in another video that every way that I've heard free will described to me, I don't agree with. And then when I hear people talk about determinism, I'm like, yeah, that is how it works. And so I guess to the question, do I believe in free will? The answer is no. Am I a determinist? Yes. But I think this makes people really uncomfortable. And I don't think it needs to, but Determined is a book that discusses this in great detail. And I think it was just very, very interesting. And the book also talks about, what I just mentioned, about how people can be uncomfortable with the idea of determinism, particularly as it pertains to criminal justice. But the author takes great lengths to describe why that isn't necessarily like an ethical issue. So I enjoyed this book in large part because I think it affirmed my stance in determinism, which isn't necessarily a good thing. Like I said at the beginning of this video, I don't want to read things that I think I'll just agree with, but this book was very affirming for that particular belief of mine. So those are the books that I picked out from my complete list. I hope you enjoyed hearing me talk about them. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. What is your favorite fiction and nonfiction book? I'm always looking for recommendations, so I'd love to hear what yours are. And before I go, I'd like to take a minute to thank you for taking time out of your day to spend watching this video. It really means a lot to me. Thank you. Bye.